She led him through the vast hall, past glimmering glass sculptures and paintings that seemed to represent every conceivable style, from surrealism to minimalism. It was clear that the gallery only showcased the most elite artists, those who had already achieved something in the art world. Marcus felt the weight of his own obscurity pressing on him. He wasn't yet a name in the industry, just a young artist trying to make a mark. They arrived at a small office, tucked away in a corner of the gallery. A woman sat behind a sleek glass desk, her dark eyes scanning the papers in front of her. The receptionist knocked lightly before entering. "Vanessa, we have someone here to see you, Marcus Kingsley." "He's the artist with the submission." Vanessa looked up from her desk, her gaze appraising Marcus quickly, her sharp features barely betraying any emotion. Her posture was impeccable, and her clothing was expensive and tailored to perfection. She had an air of indifference about her, as if she had seen it all before. She gestured for him to take a seat. "Mr. Kingsley. Please, sit. Let's see what you've brought." Marcus hesitated for a moment before sitting down. He pulled out a small portfolio case from his bag and placed it on the desk, opening it to reveal a few of his works. They were intricately detailed, full of swirling lines, geometric patterns, and bursts of color that almost seemed to pulse with energy. His work was personal, layered with hidden codes and messages that only a few might ever notice, but each one held meaning, his way of speaking to the world in a language that few could understand. Vanessa didn't immediately respond. She flipped through the portfolio with a critical eye, barely glancing up at Marcus as she did. There was no hint of excitement in her demeanor, no appreciation for the complexity of the work in front of her. She seemed unmoved, as if this was just another stack of generic art pieces she had seen 1,000 times before. She murmured, closing the portfolio with a sharp snap. She placed it on the desk and gave him a pointed look. "I'm sorry, Mr. Kingsley, but I don't think this is what we're looking for here. You're clearly talented, but these pieces are too abstract. Too raw. I don't think there's much of a market for this kind of work." Marcus felt his stomach twist. He had been prepared for rejection, but not like this. Not with such a dismissive air, as though his art was nothing more than a trivial pursuit. His heart raced, and for a moment, all he could hear was the deafening silence in the room. "I understand," Marcus said quietly, trying to keep his voice steady. "But I think there's more to my work than meets the eye. Some people—" Vanessa interrupted him, leaning back in her chair, crossing her arms. "Some people might appreciate your style, sure. But not here. We only showcase pieces with a clear message, with real substance. Your work, well, it just doesn't have that. It's a bit too chaotic for my taste." Her words stung, but Marcus wasn't about to back down. This was the world he had been waiting to be a part of, this was his moment, and he wasn't going to let it slip away. "I believe in my work," he said, his voice firmer now. "I've put everything into it. Maybe you don't see it now, but one day, people will understand what I'm trying to say." Vanessa gave him a patronizing smile, one that seemed almost rehearsed. "Well, good luck with that. I'm sure you'll figure it out eventually. But in the meantime, I would recommend that you take a look at other avenues. Perhaps art schools or local exhibitions. Those might be better suited for your style." The finality in her tone hit Marcus like a slap. He stood up slowly, his heart sinking in his chest. This wasn't just a rejection of his art, it felt like a rejection of who he was. He had worked so hard for this moment, only to be told that it didn't matter. That he didn't matter. "I'll go," he said, his voice barely a whisper. He turned to leave the room, but just as he reached the door, Vanessa spoke again. "By the way, Mr. Kingsley," she called out, her tone cold. "You really should consider finding a real job. A hobby like this can only take you so far." Marcus froze for a moment, anger flaring up inside him. But he didn't respond. He simply walked out the door, his fists clenched at his sides. As he stepped back into the cool evening air, a feeling of unease settled over him. Something about the entire encounter felt off, far beyond the dismissal he had received. but he couldn't quite place it. The more he thought about it, the more the feeling gnawed at him. He tried to shake it off. Maybe it was just frustration, maybe it was just the sting of rejection. But deep down, something told him that this was only the beginning. Something more was happening here, something he couldn't yet see. And no matter how hard he tried to ignore it, the feeling lingered. The night had fallen quietly around Marcus as he walked the dark streets, the rhythmic click of his boots echoing against the pavement. His mind replayed the conversation at the gallery over and over again, each word from Vanessa echoing in his head like a distant bell tolling in the background. It wasn't just the rejection that hurt. It was the way she had dismissed him, as though his entire passion, his very existence as an artist, was nothing more than a fleeting whim. He had been prepared for rejection. Every artist faced it, especially in a world as cold and calculated as the art industry. But something about Vanessa's words felt different. More biting. More intentional. And the way she looked at him, not with curiosity or even disdain, but with indifference, had left an unsettling mark on his soul. There was something deeper at play, something he couldn't put his finger on. Marcus didn't head straight home. Instead, he wandered through the empty streets, the city lights casting long shadows over the sidewalks. His phone buzzed in his pocket, but he ignored it. It was probably a friend checking in, or perhaps an email from one of the few people who had seen his work online. But none of that mattered right now. He couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Something had been left unsaid, something far more important than a mere rejection. He wandered into a nearby park, the cool breeze brushing against his face as he sat on a bench beneath an old oak tree. He closed his eyes, trying to clear his mind. The sensation that had taken root in his chest, something that had been there ever since he walked into Vanessa's office, wouldn't go away. What is it? He thought, trying to pin down the source of his unease. The coldness of the room? The way Vanessa had sized him up without a second thought? Or was it something in her voice, the subtle way she had dismissed him, as if his art were beneath her? He opened his eyes and looked up at the stars, their faint light barely piercing the city's ever-present glow. A shiver ran down his spine as he felt a strange, inexplicable pull toward the night sky. It was as though something was watching him, something beyond the usual, mundane forces of the world. Marcus felt it then, an odd, magnetic energy swirling around him. It wasn't the city's hum or the usual rhythm of life that everyone else seemed to follow. This was something else. Something ancient and powerful. He stood up quickly, his pulse quickening. He couldn't explain it, but it was almost as if the world around him was shifting, vibrating just beneath the surface. His instincts told him to run, to get away from whatever force was pulling him in, but he couldn't. He had to know. He had to understand what was happening. The sensation deepened as he reached into his bag and pulled out his sketchbook. Something, an invisible force, seemed to guide his hand as he opened the pages and began to draw. At first, it was just random lines, abstract shapes that flowed from his fingers like they always did when his mind was wandering. But this time, the drawing took on a life of its own. The patterns twisted and turned, becoming more complex with every stroke. They weren't just random shapes, they formed intricate geometries that seemed to pulse with energy. It felt as though the drawing itself was alive, responding to the thoughts in his head, reacting to his emotions. And as he sketched, the sense of unease only grew stronger. Marcus could hear a faint hum, like a vibration in the air itself, and he looked around nervously. There was no one in the park, the world around him eerily silent. Yet the hum continued, growing louder, until it filled his ears. His hand trembled as he added more lines to the drawing, his vision blurring slightly. It was as though the sketch was pulling him into itself, demanding his attention. He stopped abruptly, his heart pounding in his chest. His eyes widened as he took in what he had drawn. At first, it looked like nothing more than a chaotic mess of shapes and patterns, much like the rest of his work. But now, as he stared at the page, he saw something he hadn't noticed before, a hidden message, buried deep within the abstract design. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. Something embedded within the drawing was speaking to him, as though it were a code, a language that was not of this world. Marcus's breath hitched as he reached out to touch the page, his fingers brushing over the intricate lines. For a brief moment, the world seemed to pause, the hum in the air fading into a profound silence. What is this? He thought, feeling a surge of energy course through him. The sensation was both exhilarating and terrifying at once. The patterns on the page weren't just symbols. They were more, something ancient, something alive. The drawing had taken on a life of its own. It wasn't just a representation of his thoughts, it was a message, a beacon from somewhere far beyond the reach of ordinary comprehension. It was as though he had unlocked a door to something greater, something older than the world he knew. A deep, unshakable feeling settled within him that this was no accident. This wasn't just a random occurrence. It had purpose. And with that realization, Marcus's unease morphed into something else, something deeper. A strange, tingling sensation spread through his body, as if the lines he had drawn were speaking to him, guiding him. The feeling was unmistakable. He was not alone in this. The hum in the air returned, louder this time, as though the universe itself was speaking to him. Marcus closed his eyes for a moment, overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of the experience. He didn't know what it all meant, but deep down, he understood that he had stumbled onto something much bigger than himself. The art, the patterns, it was all connected, and it was only the beginning. As the night air grew colder, Marcus stood up, his sketchbook in hand. The mysterious sensation still lingered, and though he could not explain it, he felt the undeniable pull to continue, to uncover whatever it was that had awakened inside him. He had to know more. And despite the fear gnawing at the edges of his mind, he knew that he could no longer ignore the feeling. Something was happening, something far beyond his understanding. But whatever it was, he was now part of it. And he had a feeling that it wouldn't be long before the world would start paying attention. Why you should never ignore when something feels off. Marcus turned and walked home, the hum of the universe lingering in his ears, a whisper of something unknown waiting to be discovered. The next few days were a blur for Marcus. He had returned to his studio, trying to process everything that had happened. The feeling, the hum, the energy, still lingered in the back of his mind. It was as though the world had shifted slightly out of place, and he couldn't quite find the center again. He continued to draw, but now, his sketches seemed different, as though something beyond his control was guiding his hand. The lines on the page no longer felt like mere expressions of his thoughts, they felt like they were whispering secrets to him, secrets he wasn't sure he was ready to hear. Despite the constant pull toward his art, Marcus couldn't stop thinking about Vanessa's words at the gallery. He had always known that the art world was cutthroat, but the dismissive way she had treated him, as though his work wasn't worthy of even a second glance, had stung deeper than he had expected. But now, with his art taking on a strange new form, he found himself questioning whether Vanessa truly understood what she had rejected. A part of him wanted to move on from it, find other galleries, maybe even consider her advice to go back to local exhibitions. But something told him that his work was far more important than any of that. There was something bigger at play, something that was drawing him deeper into a world he could barely comprehend. It was early one afternoon when Marcus received an email that made his heart stop. The subject line simply read, "Important inquiry about your artwork." He opened it quickly, his eyes scanning the contents of the email. The message came from an anonymous art dealer who claimed to have seen Marcus's sketches, specifically, the ones he had shown at the gallery. The dealer was intrigued by the complexity of the patterns and wanted to know more about the stories behind them. At first, Marcus thought it was just another scam, but as he read on, his stomach sank. The email went into startling detail about the specific patterns in his drawings, mentioning the hidden coding that Marcus had only barely begun to realize was present in his art. It was as if the dealer knew things about his work that Marcus hadn't even fully understood himself. "Your work contains something unique," the email continued. "There are encrypted algorithms embedded within the drawings. You've inadvertently created an interface, a bridge between this world and something far beyond. This is not just art. This is something far more valuable." Marcus stared at the screen, feeling a cold shiver run down his spine. He didn't respond immediately. The words on the screen seemed to swirl before his eyes, as though they were part of the very code he had unconsciously been embedding into his art. His mind raced. He'd always felt that his art had a deeper meaning, something hidden beneath the surface, but he had never imagined it could be this profound. This wasn't just art. It was technology. It was a message, a language. The email urged him to meet with the dealer in person, claiming they had connections in the art world who would be more than willing to pay handsomely for a piece like his. Marcus's skepticism was strong at first, but as he reread the email, he couldn't deny the fact that something about it felt right. This felt like the answer to all his questions, the validation he had been searching for since the first moment he put pen to paper. Still, he hesitated. Who was this dealer? How did they know so much about his work? The more he thought about it, the more the feeling of something being off began to creep in again. It wasn't just a sense of opportunity or excitement, there was an underlying warning, a strange pull that reminded him of the moments he had felt during his first encounter with Vanessa. Despite his unease, he couldn't ignore the potential. This could be the breakthrough he had been waiting for. After much deliberation, Marcus finally responded to the email, agreeing to meet with the dealer. The rendezvous was set for later that week, in a quiet cafe on the outskirts of the city. The dealer insisted on anonymity, only sharing their first name, Evan, and no other identifying details. The meeting felt clandestine, almost too mysterious for Marcus's taste. But his curiosity overpowered his caution. If there was any truth to what Evan had claimed, then Marcus was on the verge of something extraordinary. When the day of the meeting arrived, Marcus dressed carefully, his nerves buzzing with anticipation. He had never been one to feel so out of his depth, but this was different. The cafe was quiet, tucked away from the busy city streets. As soon as he stepped inside, he spotted the figure sitting in the back corner, obscured by the dim lighting and the shadows of the room. The man was dressed in a dark suit, his face partially hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat. He seemed to exude an air of mystery, almost as though he didn't quite belong in this world. "Marcus Kingsley?" the man asked when Marcus approached. His voice was low and calm, with an odd familiarity that made Marcus's heart beat a little faster. "Yes," Marcus replied, his voice steady, though he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched more closely than he liked. The man smiled, a thin, enigmatic smile. "You have a unique gift, Mr. Kingsley. I've seen many artists in my time, but none with the subtle brilliance you've captured in your work. You've tapped into something that few even dare to comprehend." Marcus hesitated, his mind racing. "I don't understand." "How did you?" Evan cut him off gently. "It's not important how I found you. What matters is the potential of what you've created. Your art contains something more than just beauty, it's a portal. A key. You've unwittingly unlocked the ability to transmit data through your sketches, an encrypted algorithm hidden in plain sight." The night seemed to stretch on forever as Marcus sat in that room, surrounded by faces that were both familiar and foreign. He had entered this meeting with the intention of learning more, of understanding what these people wanted with his work. But the more he heard, the more it became clear that they weren't simply interested in the surface value of his sketches. They saw them as tools, weapons, keys to unlocking something far more significant. "Marcus," Evan's voice broke through his thoughts, "you're not just an artist. You're an architect. A creator of systems." He leaned forward, his eyes locked onto Marcus with an intensity that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. "What you've done with these patterns, these codes, goes beyond art. It's a blueprint. A map. And we need you to help us finish it." The words seemed to echo in Marcus's mind. Blueprint. Map. Finish it. He had always felt like there was something more to his work, something he hadn't yet fully understood. But the reality of it was hitting him now, hard and fast. These people wanted him to create something. Not just one piece of art, not just a few drawings, they wanted him to build a new system. A system that could change the world. The others at the table remained silent, observing him closely, their eyes studying him as if waiting for him to make a decision. The room felt suffocating, the weight of the moment pressing in on him from all sides. "I don't understand," Marcus said, his voice shaky, despite his best efforts to remain calm. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" Evan smiled, a predatory gleam in his eyes. "You've only scratched the surface, Marcus. The patterns you've been creating, the algorithms you've embedded, they're just the beginning. We have access to systems, databases, and networks that span across industries and governments. The world is filled with information, and your art can unlock it. You're the key." Marcus's pulse quickened as the reality of Evan's words settled in. He had known that there was something unusual about his sketches, something that made them stand out. But now he understood what they really were, pieces of a puzzle, fragments of a code that could open doors to information that most people could only dream of accessing. But at what cost? He looked around the room, his gaze meeting the eyes of the other figures seated at the table. They were all watching him with a mixture of anticipation and patience, as though they had all been waiting for him to come to this conclusion. "What if I refuse?" Marcus asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Evan's expression didn't change, but there was something in his eyes that flickered, something cold. "You don't have a choice," he said simply. "Your art is already part of this. It's already embedded into systems far larger than you realize. We've been watching you, Marcus. We've been studying your work. You're already too far gone." The words felt like a punch to the stomach. Marcus had known that things had been escalating quickly, but he had never imagined that they had been planning this for so long. His art, his life's work, had already been drawn into a web that he couldn't escape. A silence settled over the room as Marcus sat back, trying to process everything. The world he had once known, the simple life of a struggling artist, was slipping away, replaced by something far darker, more complicated. His talent, his creativity, had been exploited by these people, twisted into something they could use for their own gain. He thought about the gallery, about Vanessa, about the sneering way she had dismissed him. In that moment, it felt trivial. The rejection he had felt then seemed insignificant now compared to the weight of what was happening. But he had never imagined that the consequences of his art could be so far-reaching. Still, despite the dread that churned in his stomach, Marcus couldn't help but feel a strange pull toward the challenge. The allure of creating something groundbreaking, of having a hand in changing the world, it was intoxicating. And he couldn't deny that part of him was still that young artist, desperate to prove himself, to show that he was more than just another painter in a crowded gallery. But there was also a darker side of him that was growing louder. A side that recognized the danger of what was being asked of him. He could sense the weight of the responsibility, the consequences of crossing this line. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that there would be no going back. Once he stepped into this world, there would be no escape. Evan seemed to sense Marcus's internal struggle, and with a small, knowing smile, he leaned back in his chair. "Take your time," he said. "Think about what you want. But know this, we don't need you to make a decision today. We've already seen what you're capable of. The moment you put pen to paper, you're already a part of this." Marcus's mind raced as he processed the enormity of the choice in front of him. The art he had created, his life's work, wasn't just a personal expression anymore. It had become a tool. A weapon. And he was now caught in the crossfire between those who wanted to use it for their gain and those who would try to stop it. The realization hit him like a ton of bricks. He wasn't just facing a moral dilemma. He was staring down the barrel of a much bigger problem. His art had become the key to unlocking something much larger than he had ever intended. And the people in this room weren't interested in art for art's sake. They wanted power, control, influence. And they were willing to do anything to get it. Marcus stood up abruptly, pushing his chair back with a screech that echoed in the otherwise silent room. "I need some time," he said, his voice firm but strained. Evan raised an eyebrow, but then nodded. "Of course. Take all the time you need. We'll be waiting for you." Marcus didn't stay to hear anything more. He turned and walked out of the room, his mind reeling with everything he had just learned. The weight of the decision felt heavier with each step he took toward the door, but he knew there was no turning back. His art had already become something far more dangerous than he had ever imagined, and now he had to decide whether he would embrace that darkness or try to fight it. As he stepped out into the cool night air, the reality of his situation settled in. The world he had known, the world of galleries and critics, was gone. He was now part of something much larger, much more dangerous. And in that moment, Marcus realized that the true power of his art was not in the lines he drew or the patterns he created, it was in the choices he had yet to make. And those choices would determine not only his future but the future of the world itself. The night air was cool against Marcus's skin, but it did little to calm the storm that raged in his mind. As he stepped away from the grand estate, his thoughts were a whirlwind, tumbling over one another, fighting for dominance. The weight of the decision before him pressed down hard. He had always been an artist, a creator, but now he was faced with a choice that went far beyond his canvas. He had never imagined that his art, his passion, could be weaponized. What had once been an innocent expression of his inner world had now become the linchpin in a web of power, control, and manipulation. His work was no longer just about sharing his vision with the world, it was about holding the key to something larger, something dark and all-encompassing. Marcus paused outside the gates of the estate, staring at the city lights that twinkled in the distance. The world seemed so far away, so detached from the shadowy realm he had just entered. He had always wanted recognition, to see his work appreciated by people who understood it. But now, that recognition came with strings attached, strings that pulled him deeper into a world he didn't fully understand. He needed answers. He needed to understand exactly what he was being asked to do, what he was potentially getting involved in. He knew he couldn't make a decision without more information. But where could he turn for answers? Who could he trust? As he walked through the quiet streets of the city, the weight of the decision gnawed at him. He thought about Vanessa, the gallery owner who had scoffed at his work, who had mocked him for his unrefined style. If only she knew the truth, that his sketches weren't just pretty pictures, but keys to something much bigger. The thought of her dismissing him seemed laughable now. If only he could show her, prove to her that he wasn't just some struggling artist. But he couldn't get sidetracked by thoughts of vindication. There was more at stake now, his art had become a tool, a resource. And tools could be used by anyone, for anything. His mind kept returning to the question that had been at the forefront since the moment Evan had given him the choice: what price would he pay for this power? Marcus had always been careful about the power he wielded in his art. He had never thought of it as anything more than a way to communicate his thoughts and feelings to the world. But now, his art had become something else entirely, a currency. A weapon. A code that could be deciphered and manipulated for purposes far beyond what he could have ever imagined. The question was, did he want to be a part of it? Could he embrace this new reality, this new version of himself as a creator, or would he remain true to the ideals that had driven him to pick up a pencil in the first place? He couldn't answer that yet. But he knew he had to act fast. He could feel the weight of time pressing down on him, the people in that room already waiting for him to make his move. He looked around at the faces of the others in the room, their expressions unreadable. They weren't just art collectors. They were more than that. They were architects of a world that Marcus had never imagined, a world that was built on the power of information, on the control of knowledge. Suddenly, Marcus understood. His art wasn't just a series of codes or patterns, it was the foundation of something far more insidious. He wasn't just creating systems, he was creating a new reality. A reality where power, control, and influence could be manipulated at will. His hand trembled as he reached for the tablet that had been placed in front of him. The final piece, the code that would complete the system, was within his grasp. All he had to do was unlock it. But even as his fingers hovered over the screen, Marcus hesitated. The weight of the decision crashed down on him once more. This was it. The point of no return. If he entered that final code, there would be no going back. He would be locked into a system that controlled everything: information, power, influence. And yet, as he looked up at Evan, at the cold, calculating gaze of the others, Marcus knew that the choice had already been made. They had made it for him. His art had become the key, and now, it was time to unlock the door. With a shaky breath, Marcus entered the final code. And just like that, the system was complete. The new world had begun. As the screen flickered to life, Marcus felt a surge of dread wash over him. The doors of the building slammed shut, sealing him in. He had created the final piece, but at what cost? There was no turning back now. The new order had been born. And Marcus had given it life.